I wasn't the biggest fan of W, but he hadn't been in office for very long, and planning something like that would have taken a lot longer than, like he couldn't have possibly known he was going to be president and start planning it before then. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
The fires that burned were more like stuff in the offices, cubicle walls and chairs and things like that. And the theory is that those fires couldn't possibly be hot enough to melt steel or fatigue it in a way that could cause a catastrophic collapse. And
Factor in, like what variables to consider in this. What equations would I need? Because I've seen, when I was doing a little research, I saw a truther website where they plugged in this one simple equation, which is like a unidirectional force, which is correct, but it was based on constant acceleration, which, in the practical, real universe never actually happens because there's always some kind of resistance.
Building 7 collapsed. And Building 7 is what people really like flip out over. And, as soon as I saw that, I was like, wait a minute, this makes no sense. Both buildings collapsed fully, entirely, and they were pulverized in nearly free fall speeds successively. It does raise a few questions.
There was a building in China that was a known demolition, and it was, I think it was like 40 stories tall. And anyway, it was 118 meters compared to the 190 of Building 7. That one, being demolished on purpose, took 13 seconds to fall.
Forget about like det cord and explosives and things like that. No, the way to take down an old high-rise building is just fly a plane into it. It works every time.
Welcome to another kitchen sink microscopy. I'm Casey Rochford.
And I'm Eric Rosenblatt.
And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because that would be really cool. And stick around to the end. We've got songs. We write a new song for every episode, and you can get them on patreon.com/KSMvidcast. Take it away, Eric.
Yeah. So at the time of publication of this episode, it's September 11th, 9/11. And, I just want to start.
911 is a joke.
Yeah.
No.
I do want to start by saying, I think it was a very tragic thing. Like, there were a lot of people that died, and it was really, really awful. And I feel for the families and who lost somebody.
Yeah,
on that day.
Over 1 million in the aftermath, if you think about it.
Yeah. And I got to say that the first responders, all of you, men or women both, you got balls of steel. Like, I could not do that. So
yeah,
that was
and like nothing's been the same ever since. Like,
no, that's true. And we'll go into that. I have some ideas about it. But yeah, that was a really, really awful day. However, in the moment, it seemed like things were pretty cut and dried. Some planes flew into some buildings, and lots of people died, and buildings collapsed, and fires and explosions and all this stuff. But after that, a lot of questions started cropping up, because there were anomalies in the story, inconsistencies between what the narrative was and what people observed, and the information that was provided and the information that was uncovered. And so there's this whole community, and it's very broad. It's not just tinfoil hat, by the way. There's quite a few of those for sure, but it isn't just a bunch of kooks thinking that, oh, the government's out to get us, because, well, they totally are, but that's a whole different episode. um, the it, there are people. I mean, there are like engineers and architects and uh, pilots and all kinds of people who have called this into question. And I think this would be a good place to start talking about some of the conspiracies surrounding 9/11 and the stuff that happened.
Yeah, even a small percentage of the first responders said something was a little fishy. Most of them said it looked, exactly as you would expect. So I don't know which proportion of those people were like seasoned veterans, maybe, and maybe they'd just seen enough of this to know that that's what it looked like, and maybe the smaller proportion was newbies that were like, "What the hell? I've never seen this happen before." So I mean, I can't say for sure, but um, it's certainly there's certainly a big divide there, because there's kind of like experts in the field on both sides of things. Um, I have to say there's a lot more weighing in on the it was legit side than it was an inside job side.
Well, okay, now let's be clear too. Like, the inside job versus legit, versus it being some people doing something. I think it's a little bit different than things being anomalous. That like there could be more to the story. That's my point is, if you believe that the only two options are, it's a bunch of people from some Middle Eastern country that did it, that somehow organized and learned how to fly, and they crashed these planes. That's one side. The other side is, well, it was Bush and Cheney and they planned something. Well, I think it's different than either of those two stories. There's probably more going on. I mean, especially when you dig into it, like, objectively.
Yeah, I mean, real quick to that, I'll just say this: like, I wasn't the biggest fan of W, but he hadn't been in office for very long, and planning something like that would have taken a lot longer than, like, he couldn't have possibly known he was going to be president and start planning it before then. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. I completely don't think that Bush would have had anything to do with it.
Mm-mm.
He was completely innocent in that regard. Now, there are other forces. People will look to the president, the vice president, the top level people, but there's a bunch of people below them that actually have a lot more power who have been there a lot longer. So, maybe I don't know. And I do want to say to the viewers that it's good to question things and be skeptical, but don't take what we say or anybody else says as fact or anything. Sit and do your own research. Question things, yes, but go and do your own research and look at it objectively. Don't let anybody tell you what to think. It's good. That's the whole point of this, is we're going to raise some questions about this, because I think they should be raised, because in my view, things aren't what they seem, or things are different than the narrative, than the way they portray it, I think.
Yeah. So why don't we jump into it and
Yeah.
start with? So why don't we start with the jet fuel thing? So, as I understand it, there is some skepticism among the truthers, let's say, that they don't think jet fuel burns hot enough to melt steel, and that's kind of the basis of their argument.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and do
Yeah,
you
I've heard
know
that.
much more about like where they're coming from that in like scientific perspectives?
Well, I mean, I think they're talking about just a general fire burning, because I do know jet fuel is a lot like kerosene, so it has to be atomized to actually burn. If you had a bucket full of jet fuel and you took a lighter to it, it won't catch fire. unlike octane based things like gasoline, like those will woo, like explode. Jet fuel, it's not going to do anything. um, the fires that burned were more like stuff in the offices, cubicle walls and chairs and things like that. And the theory is that those fires couldn't possibly be hot enough to melt steel or fatigue it in a way that could cause a catastrophic collapse. And I think the melting point of steel is like 2,600 degrees or something. Um, and so that's pretty hot compared to, a chair burning.
Yeah, yeah. Well, um, I don't know exactly that much about the combustion of jet fuel, but if there's already uh, a jet fueled fire, like at the point of ignition, like let's say the force of the plane slamming into the building is enough to ignite the vapors inside the fuel tank, which then ruptures and this fiery mess comes out. Isn't it possible that that hot of fire would then take the liquid jet fuel to a gas phase just from that intense amount of heat, thereby atomizing it, of course, and igniting the rest of the fuel as it comes out?
I guess that's possible. Now, how hot that fire gets outside of a turbine engine, I don't think it really would get that hot. Not much hotter than like a typical fire if you had gasoline burning.
Um,
I mean, there have been, this is the thing. This is the only time a fire has brought down steel frame buildings. There have been fires in steel frame buildings before, like that have burned it completely out and they didn't collapse. So this is where people start to say like, hey, what gives?
well, I think that was true then. It is no longer true though, and
Okay.
I will get to that later. Um, but jet fuel burns between 800 and 1500 Fahrenheit,
Mm-hmm.
and the weak point in this argument, I think, is the fact that the steel never did melt, and it didn't have to, because about halfway to the melting point, around 1100 degrees, which is well within that range that jet fuel fires burn at, uh, that's enough to make it malleable. And when you're talking about the weight of the tallest building in New York,
Yeah,
uh,
well, keep in mind, it didn't happen at the very bottom. It happened really close to the top on both buildings. So it's not the entire weight of the building. And these tall buildings are built so that they get progressively lighter towards the top. So it's not really that much weight. But yeah, I get your point that the fatigue is really the thing, that you could actually have a failure without it actually going molten.
yeah.
However, well, maybe we'll have to go into some stories about molten metal in a minute. Um, I think that, see, the thing is, it's not one thing that gets people questioning this kind of thing. It's kind of a web of things. And, I would love to go into the interconnections between politicians and big business people and corporations and the government, because there are many. If you feel free to look that up, because it's kind of fascinating, but don't go down the rabbit hole, because it'll suck you in. Um, but that's another angle, and that's way too big for us to talk about today. Um, but let's say the top part of the building, I think it was a 93rd floor or something in one building or whatever. It was way up there. Let's say that portion of the building failed, and the structural support collapsed and one portion fell on another. And I know the NIST study said it was some kind of pancaking force, where the force collapsed, and there was so much like successive force, like each time it collapsed, that it just kept on pushing and eventually pushed it down. But I kind of wonder about that. Like, when you watch the video, the building collapsed in free fall. Like, basically, if you dropped a stone from that height, it would be falling at almost the same speed. So, that's assuming that basically the building, as those pieces collapsed into each other, basically just pulverized themselves and just kept on going, which I've never seen. How can that possibly happen?
Well,
You'd expect a little bit of upwards resistance from the supports, and eventually it would slow down, or it would just like fall over at some point, or a piece would peel off in a direction. But that didn't happen. Those buildings came down demolition style, just like free fall.
uh, okay, so this is something I can kind of speak to with a little bit of the little bit, I gotta stress, the little bit of physics knowledge I have. Um, I've taken like 2 non-calculus style physics classes, but that's enough for me to be dangerous. Like I know enough to be dangerous, and I basically, knowing how much I don't know makes it so that I think about, well, what would I need to know to factor in, like what variables to consider in this, what equations would I need? Because I've seen, when I was doing a little research, I saw a truther website where they plugged in this one simple equation, which is like a unidirectional force, which is correct, but it was based on constant acceleration, which, in the practical, real universe never actually happens because there's always some kind of resistance to factor in. But when you start talking about, I don't know, I thought the pancake effect was more about like air pressure and stuff. But what I'm trying to consider here is, with each successive level caving in on itself, you're doubling, or, like, not,
Adding to.
it's not exponential, but
Yeah.
you're adding that much more weight each time. And that's increasing the downward force against the opposing force, which remains constant. So at some point it's going to exceed that and reach that kind of equilibrium, where it appears like it's falling at free fall,
Well,
which
you can do the math. I mean, there are videos of the buildings collapsing, and they're very, very close to it. And I
uh,
think that's where people kind of like start to ask questions like, wait a minute, this is like this again, it's like a demolition. Where have we seen a building collapse like in nature happen at that speed apart from in intentional demolition? And so, because again, it's like these buildings are lighter at the top, heavier and thicker at the bottom. So you'd think eventually all of that stuff would reach a point where it can no longer condense the stuff below it. Or at least at some point it just like falls over because,
well,
and here's the thing, because it happened 2 times in a row with the 2 tallest buildings. Just free fall speeds or close to it. No resistance, nothing like, well there was it kind of was like a big explosion of material as it fell down, but it happened exactly the same way in both buildings. Then building 7 collapsed, and building 7 is what people really like flip out over. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, wait a minute, this makes no sense.
yeah, well, before we jump into that, because
Yeah,
that's another quagmire,
yeah, we'll
the
go
other
back.
forces you have to consider that I haven't seen anyone talk about really are things like the vibrations that are being sent down through the rest of the building every time a floor hits another floor. That is compromising. I mean, these are buildings that were built like 80s or before. I don't know what they're.
70s, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think building 7 was 83 or something, but yeah, those were older. So I don't know exactly what their seismic capabilities,
Well,
were. But
yeah,
if you think about
yeah,
it, like when they build something to withstand X amount of um, earthquake force, let's say, like this kind of motion, similar to vibration, they're making it, X amount on the Richter scale for like a pretty short time. But when you have this like constant barrage of like ever increasing force coming down, uh, coupled with the weakening of the interior vertical structure from the jet fuel going down the elevator shaft and stuff, all the fires like creating small explosions inside of like pressurized things, like a refrigerator compressor could explode, and um, all that stuff is contributing in some way
well,
to the whole force on the entire building.
yeah, I'll give you that. I think there's, yeah, you got a good point. The thing is, these are, let's leave building 7 alone for right now, but let's just say that those two tallest towers, um, they were hit in completely different places, and they both collapsed the exact same way. Kind of, I mean, that's something that makes me wonder about it. And the fires didn't happen throughout the entire building; they were localized to the floors in which that those two airplanes collided. So nothing else was really weakened other than those top floors. So yeah, I'll say absolutely. Even if it didn't melt the steel, you could have a collapse of the top floors. But the fact that both buildings collapsed fully, entirely, and they were pulverized in nearly free fall speeds successively, it does raise a few questions. And I don't know. Again, it's like I have some engineering experience, but there's a lot of unknowns there. But there's also a lot of questions. I think
Mm.
when you look into it, like if you look at it objectively, it is a little suspicious. Like um, that shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. So when it gets evaluated, like, in small chunks, there are portions of time where it exceeds free fall speed, and the that's not something you would expect from demolition, right?
Well, it depends on the type of demolition. So okay, because there's a lot of theories. There's some theories that are ridiculous, like, and there's a site, we'll link to this because there's actually two sites that are pretty good for people wanting to kind of study this. And they're not really like woo kind of sites, so I think it would be a good place to start. But there are theories that say, well, there was some kind of energy weapons or some kind of exotic technology or something, and nuclear bombs or bombs in the basement or something. And the one site that I'll list that actually goes very, very deeply into these things pretty much says those are bullshit. Like those couldn't happen. But there's theories like you know uh, multiple explosives throughout the building, thermite being used. There's a couple different oh god, what is the explosive technology? I could look it up probably real quick, but let's
While
see.
you look that up, I did want to mention the thermite thing. Um, that burns so incredibly hot and supplies its own oxygen, so that it burns a long, long time. If
Mhm.
thermite was used, it wouldn't have been possible for people to even walk on the rubble.
Well, actually, you know what? This is the thing. It This is why, in fact, my personal belief is that the thermite theory is the most legit theory, or a hybrid theory. Like there were more than one types of technologies used, explosive technologies. Um, I mean theory being just something I think about, like this would make the most sense. Um, the fires in those buildings after they collapsed burned for months. They were still hot for months. When in the history of humanity has a high-rise building collapsed, even in demolition, where it's been too hot to touch for months? Only World Trade Center, only 9/11. Little bit weird.
Well, it did have a giant plane in it, but
Well, but again, that fuel couldn't possibly have done that. I mean, we've had plane crashes over and over and over again that have had huge fireballs, and we could clean it up the next day. So,
yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say we've never seen this before, therefore it must be nefarious, because it's not like this has ever happened. Like in this particular scenario with that tall of buildings, and like there was one time a plane hit the Sears Tower in like 1947 or something,
yeah,
but it's like a prop plane 10 times lighter with way less fuel, and it basically just kind of stuck in like a few feet or whatever and took out maybe 2 or 3 floors.
yeah. I mean, we're talking like massive passenger planes, so
Yeah.
it's going to be a little bit different. But you know, it's still, there are still some questions raised. I mean, I do want to mention that a lot of people at the time, and of course, at the time when something big and amazing, well, amazing is probably not the right word, but something big happens, people tend to kind of fantasize a little bit about the facts around what happened. But there were people who said they thought it was a military plane. And even in some videos from actually in most of the videos I've seen, the planes can't be identified as a passenger plane. They almost look like military planes. And in fact, in if you look at some of the videos, there's a very strange thing which I've never been able to fully reconcile, that the impact, immediately before impact, if you watch these videos, right before impact, there's a brief flash on one side of the plane, and then the plane goes in and an explosion happens, and people are saying, well, these are military planes, they're outfitted with some kind of like rocket, and they fire the rocket right into the building, and that's why there's such a huge explosion. I don't know, but there is a flash. I mean, if you watch the videos, there's clearly a little brief little flash right before impact, and it adds to the suspicion about the official narrative being correct.
Huh.
So yeah, and that's the thing. This is again where I want to emphasize to people: do your own research. Don't just sit there and listen to some YouTuber, drone on and on about conspiracy theories, or don't listen to the official narrative. Like, go and do a little digging, and be objective about it. Like, try to figure out what the actual facts are, and because the goal is arriving at the truth, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And
I did a little digging on the issue of Building 7, and it's late. In particular, I focused on free fall with that one because it was like 47, 43, 47 stories tall, and I was like, okay, that I could probably find footage of similar sized buildings um, being demolished on purpose. And I thought it would probably be a little hard to find one that was actually caught on film, like just falling down from not being demolished on purpose. But I did actually find one. Um, so okay, building 7, 190 meters. So I looked for in the 40-story range to be pretty close. But it's 190 meters. It took about 7 seconds for it to fall, I think, is the generally agreed upon time. And there was a building in China that was a known demolition, and it was I think it was like 40 stories tall. And anyway, it was 118 meters compared to the 190 of building 7.
Hmm.
That one, being demolished on purpose, took 13 seconds to fall.
Huh.
It's shorter, like a good chunk, and it took 5 seconds longer to fall. The other thing I noticed that wasn't in Building 7 were visible and audible successive explosions top to bottom, like boom, 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 like pretty rapid. You could see the flashes and everything, and the China building went down uh, at a slight angle, actually.
Hmm.
uh, not even slight. Like if there was a building next to it, it would have taken that building out.
Oh
Like
wow.
it was that much of an angle. So it's like demolition doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go straight down. And it, I mean, it did look pretty similar to free fall. But
Yeah.
then I did find in 2018 in Brazil fire, like a huge inferno burning through an entire high rise. This one was a bit on the shorter side. It was 26 stories, but it also fell at what looked like free fall,
Hmm.
completely naturally.
Well, and yeah, and again, this is where I think it's really important to analyze things objectively. Like those are really good examples, and not all buildings are created equal. They're
No,
going to
no,
be
that's
made of
true. But
different materials.
I did find two examples of demolition and natural, and they both looked like they fell in basically the same way. The demolition actually looked even less controlled,
Yeah,
which is funny because it's supposed to be really controlled.
yeah. You go, and there have been mishaps, quite a few. And I'm going to go into that actually from an engineering standpoint in a minute. But and yeah, you can find examples of a lot of these things that either support or contradict the official narrative. But the thing that really brings up questions in people's minds, myself included, is that it wasn't just one building, it was three in one day. That is what is so weird about it. And I think that that's a question that deserves to be answered, because how did those three buildings fall from this exactly the same way? And I'd be completely like, you know, I'd support the official narrative if all three buildings fell in completely different directions, or the circumstances were different. One, the top of it fell off and crushed another building, and another like just burned and sat there, and another collapsed in free fall. I'd be like, okay, well, they're all a little bit different, but all three buildings fell exactly the same way. And
Well,
that is
Building 7 didn't get hit by a plane, so
no,
that's not exactly the same. It got
no,
hit with debris.
there were a few small fires going on in that building. It really wasn't even that big of a deal. And it too fell in free fall. And get this is the weird thing. So th- this is the strangest thing. So there was a bomb hardened like emergency command center housed in building 7. So designed to basically defend against an attack from bombs. In the event that there was an emergency, that was the place to go. And it too was destroyed in the collapse of Building 7, which was not hit by a plane. So, like, that's a little weird. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit, out of all of the four buildings in question, including the Pentagon, I
yeah,
think Building
correct.
7 is the strangest
Hmm.
because, I don't know where it is on a map in relation to the Twin Towers,
It,
but
it was nearby, but like nowhere near any of the collapses. There were other buildings that actually sustained damage. Like
yeah,
two buildings had giant chunks of material just penetrate the building and make a giant hole, and they were still standing. But somehow
yeah.
Building 7, that just had a couple fires burning in it, oh, it fell free fall style just like the others. And that's where people start to ask questions like, wait a minute, and I think it's a legit question to ask. And
Yeah, I mean, it does look a little odd that the only buildings that suffered complete demolition were all World Trade Center buildings.
Yeah,
I mean, two of them are very obvious because they got hit with planes. But
sure.
yeah, this like you couldn't, like, if you planned the attack or whatever to be legitimate with planes, and your goal, I'm not saying that it was a goal to take out Building 7, but if that was your goal, it'd be really, you'd have a really difficult time calculating exactly how to fly the plane into this building to project debris onto that building over there and make it fall.
Yeah, and these pilots, the people who hijacked the planes, the purported hijackers, um, they're not expert pilots. They and yet they were able to pull that off. Like that's kind of crazy. And think about this too. Demolition professionals spend years studying demolition and countless hours uh, planning a demolition of a building to get it just perfect so that it doesn't damage anything else. It falls into its own footprint. And yet 3 buildings fell pretty much by accident the exact same way. Well, I think, yeah, I think it's clear at this point. Forget about like det cord and explosives and things like that. No, the way to take down an old high-rise building is just fly a plane into it. It works every time. you know, it's kind of crazy.
I mean, I almost think that if they really wanted to put this to rest or whatever, they should construct a 90-some story building and have like a drone operated 737 basically fly into it, out in the middle of Kansas somewhere or whatever. So
Yeah.
nobody's going to
Hey, don't pick on Kansas.
Carry on, my wayward son.
No, I know what you're saying, and there are actually some people who have kind of done a miniature version of that study, and they get wildly different results. So, yeah,
I mean, you would have to do it at scale because that is an important factor in the physics.
Yeah, the mass of everything is really, really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, like that you can't scale that down really unless you accurately scaled up the other forces acting. So yeah, it would just there'd be way too many points of being able to make mistakes in that. Like,
Yeah,
to scale would have to be the way it was done, and that would be an expensive undertaking. But I mean, it would kind of steer things in one direction or the other, I think.
well, and I probably just like the moon landing conspiracy, they're just not going to invest the capital to do something like that because they'll just dismiss those people. But I think this one is a little bit more legitimate of a question because there's so many things. It isn't. It goes beyond just buildings free falling or the planes or the hijackers or the political connections. There's so many things. I mean, just like another thing. How about this? The rubble, once it finally cooled enough that they could touch it, they did very, very little forensic investigation, and then it was removed very, very quickly, and carted off to somewhere for destruction. They saved a couple pieces, but they didn't do a proper forensic investigation of why did these buildings fall? Because this shouldn't happen. An airplane hits a building, it should burn, and even if a top part collapses, it should stay standing. But it did happen thrice. And from an engineering standpoint, that's a huge no-no. You don't do that. Like if 3 buildings collapse because of some planes crashing into them, you want to know why that happened. But they never studied that. The NIST study didn't even go into that. Like, how did these buildings actually structurally collapse? It was kind of glossed over.
I mean, I saw data on that, and like there was even data to explain lever forces creating the moments where it exceeded free fall and stuff like that. Like steel beams, like pushing down on stuff like that. That
Yeah.
kind of makes sense, you know.
But that's hypothesis. They didn't actually look at the material. They weren't even given the chance before it was carted off. So, that's another question people have. Like, how come that didn't happen? Why didn't we look at it? This is a huge deal. Thousands of people died. This is like a big deal. We should be digging and looking and finding out, why did this stuff fall apart? It should not happen. How did 3 buildings get pulverized by 2 planes hitting 2 buildings? It shouldn't happen. I mean, you want to know why this stuff happened so it doesn't happen again. But instead, oh no, we're going to cart it off. We're going to create, we're going to enact the Patriot Act and create the TSA and call it good. Oh yeah, we're safe. You know, I think that's absolutely wrong. I could go on and on about the Patriot Act and the TSA. Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, 9/11 was, I mean, I don't want to say that that's the day freedom died, but it's been in
Yeah, it
critical
was.
condition ever since.
No, it was the beginning of the end for freedom. And yeah, it's. I mean, I consider the Patriot Act to be the United States' version of the Enabling Act in Germany. Um, just saying. Anybody that
Yeah,
doesn't
I
know
mean,
what it is, look it up because it's kind of there's a few of them, but 33 is the one. Hmm.
yeah, I was pretty disappointed in the fact that it's uh, hands down, irrefutably unconstitutional, and it was just done. And then I had all this hope when Obama, I believe he said he was just going to do away with it, and he never
Yeah,
did.
yeah, he did say that, and that was one of the things I was kind of hopeful for as well. And yeah, he just re-upped it.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
and
mm,
despite the fact that the threat really isn't that significant, and the TSA has gone from take your shoes off and go through the metal detector to full on body scanners, and it's getting crazier and crazier.
yeah, it's the threat has been gone basically for 18 years. It's time to do away with all those things because they've like for all the money that's been spent on it and all that they for as long as they've been around, the amount of like legitimate threats that they've neutralized are like what, 3, I don't know, like
Yeah,
if that, like they're
just a
probably
couple.
like blowing it out of proportion to say like look what we stopped.
Yeah, yeah, they are, and average citizens have actually done more to thwart terrorist attacks. I mean, here's the thing: it's security theater. It's bullshit. Like the TSA does nothing at all. You could replace all of that stupid equipment and all the like mumbo jumbo witchy magic stuff that they have, and have some air marshals on airplanes, and that would never happen again. If they had air marshals on those planes, it would be no big deal. The box knives versus handguns, no contest. It's kind of the end right there.
Yeah.
So there's easy ways to solve it. Israel has done those kinds of things, and I think we should look to what they do.
Oh
But
yeah, they had way worse terrorist attacks
yeah, yeah, like all the time, and they
in
know
the
how to handle
'70s.
it. Yeah. So yeah, it just it's ridiculous. And
Well, and the other thing is the word terrorism got so diluted. Like everything today is terrorism when terrorism has a very specific definition of trying to enact political change through fear and threatening. And
yeah, there might be a little bit of religion in there as well too, depending. But yeah, I mean, essentially that's it.
yeah, it's politically motivated, and every mass shooting that happens, they're like, this is an act of terrorism, and it's like, well,
Yeah, even Timothy McVeigh, like maybe, and that was huge. That was massive. But I want to let's go back to there's a few things we should probably talk about. the idea that that was a false flag attack. And for those who don't know what a false flag attack is, it's essentially an orchestrated event, a big event like a terrorist attack or something like that, engineered by somebody who wants to leverage that to do something else, like maybe attack another country. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is one of those. You can go into that. There are many, but some people feel that this was a false flag attack, that, designed to get people behind the idea of invading the Middle East. And the fact that we've been embroiled in there for decades now, coming up on a couple decades. I don't know, maybe it's
Yeah.
it's a thought,
Yeah, I mean, I saw something the other day that we pulled out of Afghanistan a number of years ago, and that was news to me because I thought people were still getting deployed over there. So
Yeah, we haven't pulled out of Afghanistan or Iraq. We're still in there. I
yeah,
mean,
like
in some
once we
capacity.
go somewhere, we never ever leave. So it's
Yeah, and there's money to be made. That's a thing that people don't understand. And so,
yeah, like I'm all for funding the military and taking care of veterans and all that, but we don't have to do it by creating extra work for them. You know what I mean?
yeah, I'm okay with a military force or a militia force as long as it's defensive and not offensive. But this was this, granted, we were responding to a thing, but it was absolutely offensive. And it was only like years later when we finally got the guy that we claimed was responsible in a kind of suspicious sort of in
Okay, that's another episode.
yeah, we'll go through that with the weird alien helicopters that crashed and stuff. But yeah,
But yeah, I didn't really pay attention to politics at the time when all this happened. I was relatively young, and but it really struck me as odd that we went to war with terrorism. We went to war with a philosophy, effectively, and
yeah.
attacked a country over it. Like,
Well, I'll tell you what. It sounds a lot like it absolutely sounds a lot like the war on poverty or the war on drugs. It's an aimless war.
yep.
It's war on a concept. And how can you do that? How can you actually have a war like that? It's never ending. And this kind of thing is never ending because there's always going to be people who are going to do bad things, and there's going to be people with ideology that compels them to do atrocious things to people, large masses of people, and then it just fuels the fire. And I think, yeah, you're right. Like, it's man, it's it's a mess. And you know at what point do we realize, well, and there is a certain school of philosophy that feels that our own engagements in various places in the world is actually the fuel for those fires, that us going into the Middle East and doing things and meddling and toppling governments and doing stuff, and CIA, I don't want to say anything, stop watching me. But that actually is the genesis of these attacks. And so we're doing it to ourselves. We're pissing
Yeah.
off people by trying to change things, using our own culture and ideology and applying it to somebody else's and saying, well, this is how it has to be. We're going in there and manipulating things, and it pisses people off, and people die, and they get angry, rightfully so, and then they come back and attack us, and then we're like, well, that justifies us going back and doing it again.
Yeah.
And it just keeps on cycling. It's like,
Oh yeah. Yeah. We definitely piss people off. We're definitely bullies. Uh,
yeah,
it's like there's enough countries that have it bad off to where they want to be in America, that keeps people in this idea that America is a super awesome and do no wrong kind of place, but we
It,
do
it
wrong. We do wrong.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of a neat place, but yeah, we definitely as the
Yeah, don't get me
government.
wrong. I like it here, but it's quickly wearing on me.
Yeah, the state definitely does some pretty atrocious things in the name of democracy or fighting for freedom or something like that, and I think it's wrong. I
Mhm.
think we should, and here's the thing: we went into the Middle East while like Darfur was occurring and stuff like that. There are like actual atrocities, terrible things happening. Um, and we're like, ignore it. There's no oil. There's no profit to be made. And then yet we claim the moral high ground, saying that we're doing something for some kind of humanitarian reason. No, no, no. It doesn't work that way. It's okay to do things for humanitarian reasons. That's why I think the original Gulf War, when Kuwait was attacked, was kind of legit. Like, they were invaded by Saddam. They asked for help, and we went and helped, and then GTFO, like we got out of there.
Mhm.
I think that's okay. That's all right. But everything else that we've done ever since, no, no, we got to stop meddling in there. Um, so yeah, I mean, geez, there's so many things. I do want to get to the Pentagon because that's a weird one.
Yeah, yeah. If we got time, we should touch on that. I guess I didn't look into it too heavily because I remember back in the day looking into it a lot, and um, wasn't wasn't there like this speculation that there was no plane at all or something?
Yeah, and it's okay. So here's the thing. Yet again, the state shoots themselves in the foot. They seized all video of the event and didn't release it, except for like 5 frames of something hitting the Pentagon, and it hits it so flippin' fast that it looks like a missile. So people are like, "Well, it's obviously a missile." And based on witness testimony and stuff like that, it's pretty clear it wasn't. It was actually a plane of some sort. But you know, again, they're trying to hide things, and it just amplifies all these conspiracy theories. But the thing is, the thing that's weird about it, there's 2 things. One, the section of the Pentagon that was hit was one that was undergoing renovation. So it was lightly, very sparsely populated. That was conveniently, that was the place they hit, and not a well populated place.
I mean, that
Uh,
could have been coincidence.
yeah, it could be. So then, but then you add into the fact that the flight path of the plane. Now we're talking 747, I think 737, big ass plane. So whatever it is, I can't remember, but it's a big passenger airplane. Like it's not a fighter jet, so it can't maneuver, but it flew like practically at ground level over a bunch of kind of contours and stuff and slammed right into the side of the Pentagon. Prior to that, it did some kind of like spiral and stuff. You would think if you wanted to do a bunch of damage and you were an unskilled pilot like these people were, they were totally unskilled. You just nosedive right into the Pentagon. No, they didn't do that. They took the riskiest, most difficult approach, nosedive or spiraled around to decrease altitude, and then approached it at a very low altitude, knocking down street lights and various things and stuff like that, and hit that plane. The thing is, that approach would be a challenging flight path, even for a professional. Like the best pilot on the planet would be sweating at that. Yet somebody who has no skill or very little skill,
Yeah, they
um,
did train, so
they did, but they didn't train with passenger liners like that. So it is very different flying, uh, you know, a, a Piper Cub than a 737. Very, very different. But you know, again, it's like, well, okay, it's possible, I guess. Good
Yeah.
luck
The
out.
hard parts are taking off and landing. Once you're in the air, it's basically just a joystick. So.
Yeah, well, the approach to landing in this place, a crash, is a little challenging. I mean, that does kind of go into that. Um, yeah, and that's the thing where I think people are asking questions like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. And I guess in all of this, the point is, it really doesn't add up. The facts that we're provided with, the data we're fed by the mainstream media in the state, don't add up. And people naturally ask questions. And, some people go all Alex Jones and they go off, in some kind of tangent in some weird direction about like lizard men and stuff like that. And that's all right. But, I think there are a lot of questions to be asked, and I think we should keep asking them. And,
What
and
um if they took all the footage or whatever, like how do we know it did all these spirals and shit? Like
well,
where,
there's radar information from that. Um, so I think, as far as I know, all of the aircraft had turned off their transponders, which is how they explain the fact that the jets that were presumably scrambled to intercept them, were not able to, which makes me wonder about the state of our Air Force. Like, is it really actually capable of intercepting a threat? But that's a whole different story.
well, they are now. They weren't then. Um
Yeah.
like the jets that were deployed would have had to ram it out of the air because they didn't have anti-aircraft equipment. Basically, their monitoring was aimed outward, not inward. So by the time, and it's not, they're not exactly like firefighters where they're ready to go in 30 seconds.
Some are, but
It does take a little while, and like the nearest Air Force base was a pretty good distance. So by the time you know all the communication happens and all the preparation goes, and they're fueled up and ready to go and stuff, and then they don't even have guns. It's
yeah.
like what could they do really?
Well, and there were aircraft in the air that didn't get uh, assigned to intercept. The thing is, if you look at it, it's a comedy of errors right there. Like, so many things failed, and it's a good lesson, if anything, that we think we're technologically advanced and we're so capable, and we could stop anything, and a couple people hijack a couple planes and they fly them, and we can't do anything. We're just hanging, we got our dick in our hands, like, I don't know what to do. Like, it's a good lesson.
Well, and the other thing is nobody knew what was going to happen with those planes.
That's
Like
true.
in retrospect, it's pretty easy to say, oh well, they were gonna like crash it into something, but every other, like, this is like a terrorist trope, like
Yeah.
they hijack planes, and what they do that for is to go land it safely somewhere and have a bunch of hostages so that they can affect political change.
Well, yeah,
Terrorism.
yeah, and they try to get their people freed from various places, and get some kind of whatever yeah, and that was a common thing in the 70s and 80s. That
Yeah, so it
guys,
stands to reason that they probably wouldn't have shot it out of the air even if they were equipped to, because they would have been killing innocent people that they presumably could have rescued from a hostage situation.
yeah, because the expectation is they would just land and demand a bunch of things, and whatever, we'd live to live another day, because
Yeah.
that is the trend that was prevalent at the time.
Hmm.
And it's but now everything's changed, and we've got to have our bodies scanned by X-ray, backscatter X-rays, and things like that, and
Yeah,
stuff like
because
that.
they're totally going to try the exact same thing now that we're expecting it.
Well, and that's exactly it. That is my entire point. We've spent like billions, possibly trillions of dollars on something that is basically, it's in the past. It's
Yeah,
already happened. They're not going to do that.
typical knee jerk.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so Yeah, man, I do want to talk. It'd be nice to talk about some of the cultural shifts and things that happened, like the attitudes towards Muslims and stuff like that happened after the fact. But we've already gone.
That would be a whole episode too.
Yeah, it really should be, because I've had some experience with that, and it's just like it made me want to throw up. Like, this is
Yeah,
it's pretty terrible. But we can stick to the conspiracy side of things and the government and things like that. I think that's a good place to start.
yeah,
We're coming up on an hour, so yeah.
yeah. So that's probably a good place to leave it. We covered all four buildings. We got a little bit into some stuff out of the country, but that's not still related.
Yeah.
And I think we pretty well came at it from both sides, and it's hopefully given people something to think about, and they'll kind of readdress um, their convictions a little bit, because while it has been 18 years, there are still questions, and we should always examine what we think we know.
Yeah, and I think it's always good to ask questions. It's good to be skeptical, but maybe be skeptical of your skepticism from time to time as well. Because you really, when you dig into this, it's like the flat Earth. You can go down a path that leads you to insanity.
Mhm.
So keep your head on your shoulders,
Yeah,
and use a little bit of common sense. Um, but yeah, I think
but
it's a really good idea to ask questions, especially
yeah,
when things don't add up, which this definitely doesn't.
yeah. But ultimately, I always come back to, uh, you know, think about it like an engineer would. The more points of failure you have, the less likely something is to succeed. And there would have to be a lot of moving parts for this to happen, including civilians to be in on it.
Yeah, there
So,
is the concept of compartmentalization, which does kind of counter that. There is a theory about that, which, oh man, if I could find that, that would be a really, really good one. Um, what was it? Oh man. Oh, well, if you go to the 9/11 research site, which we'll post in the links, it'll show up. There's this whole theory about like how it could be achieved with very minimal uh, staff and things like that. But again, do your own research and ask questions, and don't take anybody's word for it, and definitely don't uh, get all Alex Jones and go all conspiratorial. Yes, there are conspiracies, but not everything is a conspiracy. So, um,
yes.
yeah, and sometimes it's fun to just entertain some ideas. But again, I want to emphasize that this was a really, really terrible, terrible event, and a lot of people died, and they deserve to be remembered. And if something really nefarious happened, they deserve justice. And I don't think that's happened. Um, so, yeah. And if you're a first responder or you know somebody who was, I salute you. You're you're better than I am. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And, all the military that's, however I may feel about going to war over stuff like this, and how long we've been at war, it's not their fault. So,
Hmm.
hats off to them for doing their job, and it's dangerous stuff. So,
Yeah.
we
Balls in
definitely
the
got
field, man.
respect for all the parties involved that were, sacrificing in whatever way they did.
Yeah.
So,
They got balls
well,
of steel.
yeah,
That's
it's,
and,
it's it's really a heavy topic, and
Yeah, well,
Um,
we'll talk about the whole military versus the state kind of thing at some point. Like I think that would be a good one to talk about. But I'd like to get other people's views on this. Like, what do you think about the 9/11 uh, event? What do you think about it? And seriously, look, I have two links that I'll throw in the description, and I don't know if you have anything, Casey, but put it in there because I want points and counterpoints, um, and I want to hear what people have to think about it. What do you believe happened? What are your theories? Um, do you believe the typical narrative, the stuff that you saw in the news and mainstream media, or do you believe the conspiracy theorists? Do you have a wholly new idea? You know, um, good.
aliens.
Aliens, yeah. Well, that's the energy weapon kind of philosophy about that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I want to hear what people have to say about this because I have my own ideas and I like discussing this kind of stuff, as you know. Um, and
Yeah, so keep the conversation going, and be sure to comment and like and share and subscribe, and definitely hang out for the song that's coming up in a minute.
yeah, and thanks for Deep Sink diving with us into the topic of 9/11 conspiracies. Um, and have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.
It was a morning unlike we could have known. The sun was in the sky. Thousands of souls left their loved ones prone to forever relive that goodbye. And at the stroke of 9 o'clock that morn, a glimpse of light had caught their eyes. The culmination of politics, God, and scorn, moments away from their demise. And at the moment as thousands died, the screams were deafening as hundreds of the bravest of us tried to save those lives. The blackened skies had opened to reveal to the world a future where the mighty eagle cries. The families left with memories so scarred, picking up the pieces of their lives. When all that remains is broken, black and charred, resigned to numbers in archives. It's hard to piece together details in your mind. The sound of their voice fades away. If only God could ever be inclined to give you answers when you pray. An eagle cries from that day on, weeping for the souls that we have lost and the freedoms that it cost. And on that day, the world changed, and with it, lives have all been rearranged. We hope to never see the eagle cry.